At 7:14, Esperanza VU chaotic finished a sentence nobody heard. The transmission had been cut 11 seconds earlier. She knew this. The indicator light on the relay panel had gone from blue to the particular shade of gray that council technicians called administrative suspension and that everyone else called something shorter. She knew this too. She finished the sentence anyway, to dead air, in the same measured cadence she would have used if the Synods' entire observation gallery had been watching. Then she set down the silver pen. Not dropped. Said, the way you place something you intend to pick up again. The 1970 Sony ICF 5500W sat on the corner of her desk, as it always did, tuned to the frequency between stations. Static, the particular hiss of a carrier signal carrying nothing, which is to say carrying everything the relay infrastructure breathed when it thought no one was listening. Esperanza did not look at the radio. She looked at the window, at the pale disk of Kepler 442b's primary star doing what it always did at this hour, which was nothing remarkable. 9 seconds passed. Then she reached for the pen. The Synod's formal silencing order had arrived in the same transmission that cut her off. 47 words in the Council's preferred bureaucratic register, which favored passive constructions and the word vector appearing in contexts where the word threat would have been more honest. Humanities Cultural Broadcast Transmissions, the order read, had been classified as infection vectors under Galactic Harmony Provision 7. Subsection C, effective immediately and without appeal window. Her grandmother's lullaby, which had been part of the cultural exchange proposal she'd been mid-sentence delivering, was now, under the full weight of galactic law, a public health violation, the part that still keeps me up at night. The insult was the easy part. What she'd been waiting 14 years to do, that comes later. Kalen Voss came through the door before the order finished printing. 27 years old, from Reykjavik, and constitutionally incapable of receiving bad news without immediately drafting a response to it. He had a tablet in one hand and what appeared to be the opening paragraph of a formal protest already composed. His face had the particular set of a person who has just learned that the thing they were told to prepare for has finally happened and is angrier than they expected to feel about it. They cited Harmony Provision 7. He said, they used the health language. Do you understand what that means? They're not calling us a political problem. They're calling us a contamination. Esperanza looked at the order on her screen. Then she looked at Kalen. Then she said, they have given us what 14 years could not. Kale, then stopped. The tablet stayed in his hand. He did not, for approximately 3 full seconds, say anything at all, which for Kalen was a form of reverence. What she said next was not a protest, not a counterfiling, not an emergency appeal to the 3 species on the Council's Cultural Committee who had privately expressed discomfort with the silencing motion, not even a message to the Terran Compact's legal team, who had been ready with a challenge brief for 6 months. What Esperanza VU chaotic sent, at 7:19, was a single character string 11 digits, no spaces, to a server architecture that had been dormant for 9 years and was registered in the Stellar Synod's own infrastructure index as a xenolinguistic archival buffer, inactive, unmonitored, the digital equivalent of a storage closet no one had opened since the previous administration. The 14 relay nodes woke up, not loudly. The first diagnostic pulse was smaller than the ambient signal noise the nodes generated during their standard maintenance cycles. A technician on duty in the Synod's communication monitoring branch, seeing it on his display at 7:41, would file it under harmonic drift and note in the log that the archival buffer appeared to be running a routine self-check. He did this because that is what the pulse looked like. That is what it was designed to look like. Yusuf Khalid had spent 11 years ensuring it looked like exactly that. Kalen, who had been watching Esperanza send the string and had not understood what he was watching, said, what was that? It was not a question. Quite. More the verbal equivalent of a person realizing the floor they're standing on is not the floor they thought it was. Esperanza said. To what? To the door they just opened. She turned from the relay panel. Sit down. Kalen, I'm going to explain the last 14 years. The Hearthlight Initiative had no headquarters, no official filing with the Terran Compact's diplomatic service, no budget line, no org chart, no existence in any document that could be subpoenaed, audited, or found. What it had was 3 people, a principal, and approximately 847 terabytes of data that the Galactic Council's Stellar Synod had spent centuries trying to ensure would never exist. The principle was simple enough to fit on the back of a transit card. The most dangerous weapon is not what you say. It is what you ensure others can never stop themselves from repeating. The 3 people were Yusuf Khalid, Kale and Ross, and Lyra Vance. Yusuf was 38, from Karachi, and had spent 11 years embedded as a xenolinguistic archivist in the Stellar Synod's Cultural Preservation Wing, which was the division responsible for deciding which cultural artifacts were worth preserving and which represented, in the Wing's preferred language, redundant informational noise. In 11 years, Yusuf had catalogued 340 species worth of avian field data, filed 200 archival reports, attended 847 interdepartmental meetings, and mapped the complete relay topology of the Galactic Communication Network, identifying the 14 critical broadcast nodes that carried 89% of all Council-propagated cultural suppression. His cover hobby was birdwatching. He kept a holographic field guide. Entry 217 was the Rufous-tailed rock thrush. Its song, in the field guide's audio archive, had a duration of exactly 11 seconds. The authentication string Esperanza had just sent was the Rufous-tailed rock thrush's song, transcribed into frequency data, SCCTION to BREAK5. 0 characters. Kalen already knew most of his own part, but he hadn't known, until Esperanza laid it out in the spare geometry of someone who had rehearsed this briefing in her head approximately 400 times over 14 years, was how his part fit into the others. 6 years ago, Kalen had been placed through channels he'd understood, at the time, as a standard deep-cover cultural intelligence boasting into HFY cultural circles and then into Salva academic enclaves. His discovery, 18 months in, had been the kind that either breaks an operative or makes them into something harder than they were before. The Salvian aristocracy had been systematically erasing pre-council cultural artifacts for 200 years. Not destroying them, precisely, reclassifying them, archiving them into access tiers that required permissions no non-Salvan institution could obtain. The cultural record of a dozen species existed, technically, but was as accessible as a book sealed inside a vault sealed inside a mountain sealed inside an administrative process with no public-facing intake for. The youth of those species had grown up with the abridged version of their own history, the approved version, the version in which the Stellar Synod's harmonization policies had been a gift, not a surgery performed without consent. What Kalen had also discovered, in his second year, was that humanity's cultural transmissions music, they broadcast fiction, oral histories, the sprawling digital mess of human creative output that the Council had been quietly trying to suppress for decades were the first broadcast that Salvian youth, and the youth of 6 other species, actually wanted to hear, not because humans were special, because the transmissions were loud and unedited and full of people disagreeing with each other in public, which was, to a generation raised on harmonized cultural product, the single most radical thing they had ever encountered. Kalen had filed this as intelligence. He had not known it was already the plan. There's a contingency, he said, not quite a question. If they hadn't issued the silencing order, if they just kept suppressing quietly, indefinitely, there's a contingency protocol. Esperanza looked at him. It would have been, she said, a very good archive. Kalen stared at the wall for 4 seconds. The third member of the Hearthlight Initiative was Lyra Vance. Lyra was 33, from Tucson, and she could not come home. For years ago, during a deep-cover data extraction from Salva and Central Archives, Lyra had been caught. What followed 18 months of isolation in a Salva and intelligence facility on a moon with no name. Any human database had done what isolation at sufficient depth tends to do, which is make the architecture of a person's convictions visible to them in ways that ordinary life does not. Some people discover, in that visibility, that their convictions were never as structural as they believed. Lyra had defected to Salva and intelligence. She had given them 3 months of operational data before she understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has just made the worst decision of her life, that she had not actually changed sides. She had simply lost, briefly, the ability to remember why she was on the side she was on. She came back. She brought 400 hours of internal Salva and communications proving that the silencing vote, the vote that was, as of 7/14, now official galactic policy, had been planned for 11 years, not as a response to human cultural broadcasts, as a conclusion. The Salva and aristocracy had decided, 11 years ago, that humanity's voice would eventually need to be removed from the galactic record entirely. The broadcasts were not the cause, they were the pretext. The report was classified, in Salva and documents, under the phrase cultural hygiene. Lyra now lived in a sealed safe house on Kepler 442b. She could not return to Earth because her defection, even briefly, even retracted, had made her presence on Earth a liability the Terran Compact could not formally acknowledge. She sent her mother crossword puzzles. She wrote the puzzles herself. The clues were coded mission updates. Her mother, who was 71 and lived in a narrow house near the university, solved them slowly, over tea. Not knowing the clue to 7 across was confirmation that her daughter had successfully re-established contact with the relay network. Not knowing that the clue to 14 down meant I am still here. I am still fine. I will not be home soon. Esperanza had read every puzzle. The silencing vote had not been unanimous. In the Synod's observation gallery, arranged in the curved tiers that allowed each species delegation to see both the chamber floor and each other's reactions, the vote had proceeded with the efficient choreography of a body that had rehearsed this particular motion in committee sessions for 2 years without ever putting it to a formal record. Archon Solmir Th, representing the Salva and delegation, had not needed to speak. His motion had been seconded, debated in the procedural minimum required, and carried with 31 votes to 1. The one had come from the HFY delegation. That Orin was 67 years old, which in HFY terms meant he had been observing galactic politics since before Esperanza's mother was born, and he had the particular quality of attention that very long observation tends to produce, the ability to watch a thing happening and see, simultaneously, the 14 other things it was a continuation of. His skin translucent, shot through with the bioluminescent pulse network that HFY used for emotional communication the way humans use their faces, had gone to a slow, deep blue during the vote. Gravity, the particular pulse that meant this moment is not what it appears to be, and I am the only one in this room who knows that yet. He had cast his descending lip pulse. Then, moving through the dispersing delegations with the unhurried drift of someone who had somewhere to be and no intention of letting anyone else know where, he had found Esperanza. What he offered her was a water bead. Ceremonial, a small sphere of compressed hydrogel threaded through with HFY biomineral, traditionally offered to the recently bereaved. His bioluminescence pulse had shifted to the slow amber that signaled compassion. He had watched her finish a sentence to dead air, set down a pen with excessive deliberateness, and then sit in complete stillness for 9 seconds. In HFY culture, prolonged stillness following a public loss indicated grief so total that language had temporarily failed. He was offering comfort to someone he believed was in mourning. Esperanza took the bead. She looked at it for a moment. Then, with her thumbnail, she pressed the specific point on its equator that activated the date, a crystal concealed inside it, and the bead dissolved into a dry film of mineral residue on her palm, and the crystal interfaced with her relay panel, and 600 kilobytes of classified intelligence unpacked themselves in the archival buffer that Yusuf's 14 relay nodes were already warming. Orin watched this. His pulse shifted. Not amber anymore, not the deep blue of gravity. Something Esperanza had no word for in any language she spoke. A rapid flicker in the ultraviolet register that she could only perceive as a faint shimmer at the edge of the visible spectrum. You are not the first species they have done this to, he said. His voice had the HFY quality of a declarative that was also a historical record. The Synod has silenced for others. 3 are gone. The 4th holds 40,000 living members in a protected zone the size of a small moon. Under terms they did not negotiate. His pulse steadied. Your species does not fight with fleets. You fight with memory. The Synod has never faced an enemy that weaponizes what it means to remember. Esperanza said, I know. We found 2 of the names. That Orin's bioluminescence network went. Briefly. To full transparency. No pulse at all. To human eyes, he became for a moment almost invisible. A glass sculpture in the corridor's low light. Then, the light returned. How long? He asked. 14 years, she said. 14 years. The Synod had been planning the suppression vote for 11. Humanity had been preparing the response for 3 years longer than that. The archive Yusuf had spent a decade building contained not only human art and music and oral history but the suppressed cultural works of 4 species including the 3 now extinct, whose names existed nowhere in the Synod's official record and everywhere in the Hearthlight Initiative sealed files. The plan had never been to fight the ban when it arrived. The plan had been to ensure that when the ban arrived, the flood that followed it would be, in the most precise technical sense, unstoppable, not because of military force, not because of economic leverage, because the archive was not stored in any single location that could be raided, seized, or administratively reclassified. It had been threaded, over 14 years, through the carrier frequencies of the relay network itself, the quiet hiss between stations. The signal infrastructure breathed when it thought no one was listening. The static, the nothing that turned out to be everything. The 1970 Sony ICF-5500W on Esperanza's desk hummed its familiar hiss. She had not looked at it once since 7:14. She didn't need to. She already knew what was in it. The execution began at 7:14. Across the relay network's 14 dormant nodes, the first pulse moved the way sound moves through a building at night, not from any single source, not toward any single destination, but through the infrastructure itself, the way a structure settles. Node 1 processed its authentication at 7:19. Node 2, 12 seconds later, the Synod's communication monitoring branch registered both as harmonic drift in the archival buffer, filed the reports, and moved on. The technician on duty noted the events in a log that no one would read until much later, when reading it carefully would be one of the more uncomfortable professional experiences of his career. By 7:31, 3 nodes were active. In the Cultural Preservation Wing's secondary monitoring room 3 floors below the chamber where the silencing vote had been filed 17 minutes earlier, a junior analyst named Pretouch Vasai noticed that the archival buffer was generating signal output on civilian relay channels. Small. The kind of small that, in 11 years of relay monitoring, she had learned to classify as instrumentation error and document accordingly. She documented it accordingly. The signal was a thresh violament from the late 3rd century. A vocal composition for 4 voices that the Synod's Harmonization Committee had reclassified as culturally non-generative in 2019 and quietly moved into the restricted archive tier, on a civilian channel on the HFY homeworld. 3 people heard it, then 11. Then, because it was the kind of music that does something to the body before the mind has a chance to weigh in, 43 people had shared it to secondary channels before Preeti HFY filed her second instrumentation error report. Yusuf Khalid, at 7:38, opened his holographic field guide to entry 217. The Rufo's staled rock thrush, orange tail, blue-gray head, habitat range across the mountainous regions of southern Europe and Central Asia. Song duration 11 seconds. He scrolled through the entry the way a person consults a reference they already know by heart, which is to say without looking at it, and entered the authentication string for nodes 4 through 7. The whale librarian stamps are returned 8. Routine. Procedural. The field guide closed. He picked up his tea. 4 more nodes came online. The signal that moved through them was not a lament. It was a more VHN epic and oral history composition from a species whose cultural record had been in restricted access archival tiers since 2031. A species whose youth had grown up knowing their grandparents had stories but not knowing what the stories were. The composition was 340 years old. It had been recorded once, by a single elder, and the recording had been in the Hearthlight archive for 9 years. By 8:30, it had been heard by 11,000 people across 6 worlds. In the Synod's monitoring branch, the instrumentation error reports had stopped. What had replaced them was a different kind of document entirely, the kind that uses phrases like anomalous propagation pattern and source determination pending and is rooted, with increasing urgency, to supervisors who root it, with increasing urgency, to people who have the authority to do something about it and are discovering, in real time, what something means when the signal is already inside the infrastructure that would be required to stop it. It means nothing. It means the door is already open and the room beyond it is already full. By 10:15, 8 nodes were carrying signal, not human signal. Primarily, the archive that Hearthlight had spent 14 years building was not a human archive with supplementary alien material. It was a record of everything the Synod's harmonization policy had classified as redundant, non-generative, culturally destabilizing, or in the phrase Lyra Vance had pulled from 400 hours of internal salva and communication subject to cultural hygiene. Human music was in it. So were the suppressed folk cycles of the more VHN, the bioluminescent and spulse poetry of the Thresh Eye, the harmonic resonance compositions of the Keller Eye, and the oral histories of 3 species who no longer existed to hear them recovered. That last category was the one that traveled fastest. The youth of 8 species, raised on the harmonized, committee-approved version of Galactic cultural history, discovered simultaneously that the approved version had gaps. Specifically, that the gaps were shaped exactly like the cultures the Synod had classified, in internal documents now broadcasting on every civilian relay channel, as hygiene problems. The word spread the way words do when they arrive already carrying their own indictment. On the Salva and Homeworld, in the academic district adjacent to the Synod's central tower, a group of university students who had been listening to human protest music for 2 months silently, on secondary channels, because the music was loud and unedited and full of people saying in public what was only said in private on the Salva and homeworld began at 10:47 to sing, not the human song. Exactly. They didn't have the vocal range for it. What they did was harmonize the melody against a HFY pulse chant pattern, the kind their own cultural archives had classified as extinct, because the species it came from had been classified as extinct. And the two sounds together made something that was not human and not HFY, but was unmistakably the product of two cultures that had, despite the considerable institutional effort of the Stellar Synod, managed to find each other. Two Keller Eye observers passing through the atrium stopped walking. The harmonic resonance was close enough to a Keller Eye morning frequency that their chit and plates began, involuntarily, to vibrate in sympathetic response. They looked at each other. The vibration was embarrassing. It was also, and this was the part they could not stop, beautiful, that Orin watched from the HFY observation deck at 11:09. His bioluminescence network was running the rapid ultraviolet flicker. He had no word for in Esperanza's languages, the one that meant something between recognition and inevitability. And I have watched this building fall for 67 years, and here is the moment the first tone moves. He had been wrong about Esperanza's stillness. He understood this now, cleanly, in the way understanding arrives when it has been withheld long enough that the arrival feels like a door opening rather than a door found. He had offered a water bead to a woman in mourning. She had not been in mourning. She had been standing in a room full of people who did not know they were already surrounded, and she had been too professional to let her face say so. The 9 seconds of stillness after the silencing order, the stillness he had read as total grief, had been 9 seconds of cold arithmetic. 14 years had prepared every node. The order had activated every node. The math had taken 9 seconds. Then she had reached for the pen, not to write, not to document, to confirm. His pulse ran slow and deep blue, the color of gravity, the color of a moment that will exist in the historical record long after everyone present has died. Below, in the atrium, the singing continued. At 11:24, Esperanza picked up the silver pen. The relay panel showed 12 nodes active. The count of confirmed recipients and past numbers that the panel's display had not been designed to render in real time. It was calculating in units of 10 million and still having to scroll. KLN was standing 3 feet away, very still, which for KLN was its own kind of statement. The room smelled of recycled air, and the faint mineral residue of the dissolved water beat still on Esperanza's palm. She uncapped the pen, set the cap on the desk beside the relay panel, checked Node 13's authentication window, entered the string, waited for seconds for confirmation. Then she capped the silver pen with a click, and the seed vault light stuttered 3 sectors away. The 14th node came online. The archive, all 847 terabytes of it, threaded for 14 years through the carrier frequencies between stations, through the static that nobody monitored because it carried nothing, began to replicate, not broadcast, replicate, embedding itself in the relay infrastructure the way a pattern embeds itself in a material it has been pressed against long enough. The Council could not shut it down without shutting down galactic communication. The signal was the infrastructure now. At 11:31, Archon Salmir Th walked into the Synod atrium. He had been told, by 3 separate communication officers in the preceding 40 minutes, that the situation was being contained. He had found, in each of those 40 minutes, that being contained was a phrase his communication officers used when they meant we are filing reports about the thing we cannot stop. He walked into the atrium because the atrium was where the singing was coming from. And he was the kind of person who believes that looking directly at a problem is preferable to receiving reports about it. Salvian youth, his own species youth, born in the academic district in the shadow of the Synod's central tower, raised on the cultural product that the Synod's Harmonization Committee had approved, curated, and presented as the complete record of Salva and civilization. Singing, not a Salva, not a human song, something that had not existed before 1047, once heard, cannot be unheard. Salmir Th watched for 31 seconds. His calcified cranial ridges angled forward slightly. The micro-expression of a species whose hierarchy communicates through posture held their position. His scent glands, which a Salva, an aristocrat of his generation, controlled with the discipline of a reflex suppressed since adolescence, did not activate. He reached for a signet ring. 1/4 turn. Later, the ring would be logged in the Mercy Charter's accountability archive. Lot 7. Evidence category personal effects. Date of last known used the day the vote failed. The quote that would appear in the historical record came not from Esperanza, not from Vet H. Orin, It came from an internal salva, an intelligence debrief conducted 6 days after the vote, when the Synod's senior council was attempting to understand, in the precise bureaucratic language of an institution unaccustomed to accountability, what had happened to them. The officer conducting the debrief asked Salmir Th directly what had the Synod failed to anticipate. Salmir Th said, "We insulted them because we believed they could do nothing about it. We were catastrophically wrong about what they could do about everything else." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The Mercy Charter Council convened 12 days later. Its first act was the Transparency Clause. All deliberations broadcast live, every vote attributed and archived in perpetuity. No closed sessions, no administrative suspensions, no harmony provision 7 and no subsection C and no phrase ever again in any official document resembling the word hygiene in the context of culture. The clause was not debated. It passed without amendment because the 3 delegations who might have amended it had already done the arithmetic on what amendments would look like in a live broadcast, and had decided against. That H. Oren served as interim speaker. His bioluminescent pulse, at the opening of the first session, ran slow and gold, a frequency threshold use for formal solemnity. For the marking of a threshold between one kind of time and another, he read the preamble. 7 names. The reading took 4 minutes. The first 3 were from species the Synod's official record listed as extinct. Esperanza had pulled their names from the Salva and Archives. Lyra had brought back names that existed in no galactic database. No commemorative record, no monument. They had been in the Hearth Light files for 9 years, waiting for a document that would be read aloud in a room where the ventilation system still hadn't been repaired from the power surge and had accompanied the 14th node going active. The ventilation hissed. No one spoke during the names. Not Ved H. Oren, who paused between each one the way a threshold pauses between pulse beats long enough to feel the space. Not the Kellerite delegates, whose chin plates had gone still with the particular resonance of a species that grieves collectively and quietly. Not Kalen, who was in the 3rd row and had the expression of someone who had spent 6 years angry at a wall and discovered the wall had, for 6 years, been angry at the same things he was. Not the Morva HN elder in the 2nd tier, whose 6-fingered hands were moving in the small continuous grammar of oral history, keeping tracing the names in the air as they were spoken, so that the gesture would exist in the record, even if the record was lost. The 4th name was Lyra Vance, alive, in exile, in a sealed safe house on Kepler 440b, where she was, at the moment of the reading, writing a crossword puzzle. 14 across, the thing that carries a message when no one knows it's carrying one. Answer. 7 letters. Her mother would solve it in the morning, over tea. Not knowing. The 5th name was Yusuf Khalid. He was already back in Karachi. He had taken a teaching position at the university. His students, who did not know what he had spent 11 years doing, found him unusually patient with slow learners and unusually specific in his praise when a student noticed a detail others had missed. The 6th was Kale N. Voss, who looked at his own name in the preamble's printed text and then looked at Ved H. Oren and then looked at his hands. The 7th name Esperanza had chosen herself. She had not told anyone whose name it was. When Ved H. Oren read it, the name of a HFY cultural scholar, dead for 40 years, whose pulse poetry had been the first thing the Salva and Harmonization Committee had reclassified 2 centuries ago, in the first act of what would become the Synod's systematic erasure. Ved H. Oren's bioluminescence network went, briefly, to full transparency. The chair at the head of the Mercy Charter's table was empty. Esperanza had been offered it. She had declined without explanation, which was itself the explanation. The architecture of the new order did not require her to sit in it. She had already done the sitting. For 14 years, in rooms where the insult was the weather and patience was the only instrument worth carrying. She was on a transport back to Earth. The 1970 Sony ICF 5500W sat on her lap, not on the desk. Like her lap, the way you hold something that has traveled with you long enough that its weight is familiar. The dial was between stations, static, the same static that had always been there, that had been there for 14 years of diplomatic sessions and 9 seconds of cold arithmetic and 4 hours and 17 minutes of execution, that had been there when it was just static and when it was the breathing of an archive, and now, when it was neither and both 40 billion voices absorbed back into the frequency between stations. The signal embedded so deeply in the infrastructure that separating it from the silence would require dismantling galactic communication itself. She did not look at the stars. The question was not whether the Mercy Charter would hold. The question was whether humanity, Having discovered that memory is the one weapon the Council's bureaucratic machinery cannot file, reclassify, or route to a supervisor, whether humanity would choose to stop sharpening it, whether the species that had waited 14 years to prove that patience could be a weapon would know. Now, when to set the weapon down. Esperanza VUK Odic adjusted the dial. More static. Her plan, where the water bead had dissolved, was still faintly damp. The transport moved through the dark. The radio hissed. Somewhere inside that hiss, 40 billion beings were still singing, or would be, or had been, the signal no longer obeying the grammar of tense. She did not answer the question. She turned the dial.